So we open our Bibles this morning to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 13, verse 15. Nehemiah 13, verse 15, as this morning we come to the end of this book that we've spent certainly several months in. It's an interesting book, Nehemiah, especially I think the last chapter, because the book starts with a nation that is really away from the Lord, and one man, Nehemiah, who is 700 miles away from the nation, but yet has a tremendous heart for God. And through much prayer and his willingness to be used, God sends Nehemiah to Jerusalem to build a wall. And by the time the wall is finished, the thousands who are not walking with God now want to. And Nehemiah's leadership has turned the hearts of the people back to God. There is a tremendous revival that takes place, unprecedented really at the time. There was, thousands upon thousands of folks coming back to the Lord. And by the time that Nehemiah had been there for 12 years as a builder, an overseer, a governor, he was, according to verse 6, called back by Artaxerxes to Shushan, or back to Babylon. We don't know how long he was gone, but we know he was gone several years. When he came back, the end of the book is much like the beginning. The people were again away from the Lord. And what happens between chapter 2 and chapter 12 seems insignificant or inconsequential to them. They are back to square one. Only this time Nehemiah is the fellow who has to come back. And to a city that he loved, and to a people he had led, and to a God that he had served, now he finds the city not in revival, not hungry for the word of God, not desirous to worship and bring sacrifice and serve and put aside their personal interests for the sake of the things of God, or their business interests, set them aside so that the Sabbath could be maintained. They had all but gone back to the way things used to be. Eliashib, the high priest, had moved a guy into the temple where the things of God that had been dedicated to the Lord had once been stored, but because the priests and all weren't any longer supported, the temple was closed, and the priests were farming. And there was no spiritual life to the people. Eliashib had lined himself up with Tobiah, one of the perennial enemies of God's people. There was no spiritual leadership. There was a great corruptness amongst the folks. The temple, like I said, was closed. The Lord had been set aside. And the people just went right back to the exact same problem that got them there to begin with. And I find it such an important chapter because it does appear to me that the lesson should be that we have to remain diligent in our walk with God if we're going to continue to do well. You cannot live on last month's blessing or last week's sermon or yesterday's prayer time. It just won't sustain you very long. It's meant to be kept current. And when the people let that go, everything went. It's like exercising. You feel great going to the gym if you keep going, but stop for a month. And then go back and you go, nothing has changed. I'm as out of shape as ever. It works if you keep at it. And I think that that's the key. It is far easier than you can imagine to slide down the hill away from intimacy with God. It is far easier than you can imagine to let your spiritual life become mundane and ritualistic and habitual rather than vibrant and alive and personal. And you can certainly see it go down the tubes what once was. And to fall quickly is exactly what the enemy wants. Now, Nehemiah comes back after several years, and he's the consummate leader, He has a position of authority that allows him from a governmental standpoint to force change. You can't legislate righteousness, but you can, from a government standpoint, if you're in power, do those things that would please the Lord. Whether people like them or not is inconsequential at that point. He's the leader. And Nehemiah comes back and he begins to correct problems immediately. We saw last week he tosses Tobiah out by the curb as well as all of his stuff. He brings guys in to fumigate the place. He fills the rooms again with the offerings that were to be given to the Lord so that the temple could operate. He goes and gets the priests out of the fields and tells them to report to duty. People need to worship again. And he just forcefully and with great determination brings the people back to a daily response. The people in verse 11 of this chapter respond with great joy. And Nehemiah in verse 12 and in verse 13, he even replaces the corrupt with the dependable and the faithful, and the people have a great confidence again to come back to worship and begin to walk with God. He makes it accountable and all. Now these moves didn't make him popular. You know, in verse, we mentioned last week, verse 14, again this morning in verse 22, again in verse 31, he says to the Lord, please remember what I've done. You know, please bless the changes, make them effective, because it seems to me the only one being pleased in this process might very well have been the Lord. There wasn't a consensus of, you know, we need to get right with God again. No one was interested, except for Nehemiah, the man that God had used. And after what had certainly seemed, I would think, traumatic months, if not more, Nehemiah prayed that the Lord might bless the hard steps that he'd taken. He had really muscled his way through to say to the people, look, this can't continue like this. We're not going to be blessed. So this morning we'll finish with these last 16 or 17 verses, but the whole chapter cries out, stay diligent in your walk with God. You know, put the effort and the time in, make sure that you are convinced who you're following, and do it. And don't give yourself an out. I think that the danger for the church is always relative holiness. By that I mean, you can always find people that aren't doing as well as you, and then you're content with you. You know, it's kind of like, well, I go to church more than he does. So what we do is we find people more, or I should say less holy than us, and then we feel good about our relative holiness. Then there's only one step left. Surround yourself with very ungodly people. And then you can do whatever you want and still feel good, you know, because everyone you know is worse off than you are. But the standard isn't your buddies. The standard is God's word. And Nehemiah was the only guy willing to run with what God had said. There can't be relative holiness in our life, you know. You can't talk about it and not do it. You can't preach it without living it. If it isn't part of your life, then you're fooling yourself. And Nehemiah is a pretty drastic guy. I mean, he's a type A guy, you know. He's going to come out and let you know what's going on. But he does so for the love of the people and for the sake of the Lord. And it brought the nation great blessing in the years that followed. But he was for real. So I think the warning of the chapter is daily diligence. You got to be daily diligent. You should be going forward, not backwards. And it's real easy to go backwards. You know, what once was a joy can now be a chore. That's a problem of the heart. So we'll start in verse 15, where Nehemiah continues about his return. And he says, in those days, I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine and grapes and figs, all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling their provisions. Now, we mentioned, I think, last week as well, the Sabbath was a deal that God made with God's people back in Exodus. I think the original Sabbath law was 7 words long. Now, what man does with that is ridiculous, but God's purpose was basically this. Teach the people that at one point in their life each week, they should set aside their commerce and business and gain and worldly ambition and stop and realize that God was the one who provided for all of their needs. That it should be a day dedicated to rest and fellowship and the things of the Lord. And just a reminder, you don't need to kill yourself to provide for yourself. God is the provider. You're to work hard, you're to be faithful, but in the end, God is the one who provides. It would become the backdrop as the years would pass to say to us, when it comes to your salvation, it's the same way. You're supposed to seek the Lord and walk with God and read his word and put yourself in the right place. But God saves, you don't. So if you can rest from your labors and quit trying to fill out your resume to hand in at the heaven's door, here, let me in, look at what I've done. If you realize that God saves, you don't, then you've entered into his rest, into Jesus' work. He's our Sabbath in the New Testament. But for them, in Nehemiah's day, it was solely a willingness to lay aside the earthly life, the flesh life, the temporary life, for the eternal. And when Nehemiah left, and the temple closed, and the giving stopped, and the teaching dried up, the holiness of the Sabbath was hardly an interest to anyone. What they were interested in was what everybody in the world was interested in. Let's pursue commerce. Let's get while we can get it. This is just another work day. A far cry from what you read in chapter 9 and 10, where the people, as they began to look at themselves in light of God's word, said, I bet the Lord's angry that we've never kept the Sabbath. I'll bet he doesn't like the fact that we just live our lives as if he doesn't exist. And we're going to restore that. That's not going to happen anymore. And they forcibly and willfully changed their way of life. And God began to bless. When they were humble and repenting and hungry for God, they realized that was neglected. It was disobedience. It broke their hearts. They vowed never to let it happen again. But they get out of fellowship. They get away from the scriptures. They get away from their spiritual well-being. There's no leadership to help them. And the bottom line is, they soon move away from those things, and the flesh and sin take over again. It's always the way it is if we're not daily diligent. We read in verse 16 that there were even men from Tyre, hundreds of miles up the coast, who came to dwell there also, bringing their fish and all kinds of goods, selling them on the Sabbath to the children of Israel in Jerusalem. Nehemiah couldn't have been angrier. Look how he piles up the words. In Jerusalem, on the Sabbath, to the children of God. And so I, verse 17, contended with the nobles of Judah. And I said to them, what evil thing is this that you're doing by which you profane the Sabbath day? The word contend is a very strong Hebrew word that means to scream at the top of your lungs. Nehemiah was a passionate guy. This wasn't just take it or leave it. We unfortunately do that with spiritual things. We minimize sin. We think that, just live and let live. It's no big deal. What do we care? We'll hang around people living in adultery. We'll call them our buddies. We'll go, out to dinner with them. We don't care about sin, but God hates it. And there should be a standard by which we live. And we should demand it in our own life. And Nehemiah was certainly a guy to do that. But notice that he goes after the rulers. Verse 17. It's always the leadership that sets the tone. Nothing wrong with business. Nothing wrong with working and working hard and getting ahead and having some kind of an ambition. But the problem was this was on the Sabbath. And the people had put the Lord down their list of priorities. They weren't leading others to the Lord anymore. They were being led by the men of Tyre. The people that set the tone for the lives of the saints of God were the men of Tyre. And that's a tragedy. When the world begins to set your tone and your priorities where you care more about the things of the world than the things of the Lord, that's when people falter. But the reason was they had set aside their daily walk with God. They had set aside their relationship with him. And so Nehemiah just comes yelling and screaming. He lets them have it. What is this evil that you're doing before God, allowing the people to profane the Sabbath? You should know better. And Nehemiah gets to play the bad guy again. But he's not really the bad guy. He's just the only guy willing to step up and speak out and say, look, this isn't right. He loves the people enough to say something. So often we are more interested in being well-liked than blessing the Lord. And so we say nothing. We don't want to speak up. But, I think sometimes there's a time to speak up and just go, this is not right. This shouldn't be this way. He said in verse 18 to them, didn't your fathers do this? And didn't our God then bring this disaster upon us and the city? You're adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. They were still just getting out from the last time God had to judge them. And now they were beginning to store it up again. Don't you get it? When are you going to wake up? Who's in charge here? God, give us some godly leaders. And so, verse 19, it was that the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that they be shut. And I charged that they must not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I posted some of my own servants at the gates so that there be no burdens brought in on the Sabbath day. Now, the solution was very interesting because it was political in the sense that Nehemiah was the boss. He was the governor. He had absolute authority. Did he change a ruler's heart by doing this? Probably not. There's no way to forcibly make someone righteous. But on the other hand, when it comes to leading, the leadership certainly has the obligation to set the tone and the practices for the people who follow. And whether they liked it or not didn't really matter. God would like this. And God would bless those who followed. And from a governmental standpoint, he took the lead. He contended with the rulers. He kept commerce out. We will honor the Sabbath. There will be no buying and selling. And I'll put my own guys at the gates and they're not getting in. These men of Tyre are out of business now. We've had interesting experiences in the church over the years with folks wanting to come and market you. Folks leaving their Avon books on your car, or their Tupperware ads, stuck in the foyer next to the bulletins. If we find them, we usually call them and tell them they have one more time to not do that, or they'll be arrested for trespassing. Because we don't think you should be marketed. We think you should be able to come and worship the Lord here, and what you buy is up to you, but we're not going to sell it to you. We had for years a church directory, which when the church was very small was kind of cool. You could know everybody's name and what they did for a living, what the name of the kids were. It could cover you when you saw someone. You could, oh yeah, that's their name. Because I wasn't ever good with names. It was really a personal issue. But then somebody got a hold of it, and he was an insurance salesman, and he called everybody and said, well, I talked to the pastor. He said, it'd be all right if I called you, and he tried selling everybody insurance. So we got rid of the directory altogether. So I like the fact Nehemiah puts his staff at the gates. He's just not putting up with it anymore, Not forcing righteousness, but leadership has the capacity to make policies and practices that when implemented will bring honor to the Lord. Now what it does in the heart, that's God's issue. But what it does on the outward is Nehemiah's responsibility. And we read in verse 20 that the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares, they began to lodge outside of Jerusalem's gates then once or twice. And so Nehemiah goes out to warn them, and he says to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I'll lay hands on you. And from that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. See, I like Nehemiah. A couple of weeks come by, these guys are clamoring outside, and Nehemiah wants to lay hands on them. I don't think he means he wants to pray for them. I don't think it's that kind of laying on of hands, But I love his passion. The guy is committed to doing things right for the sake of the people. This isn't winning him any points. This isn't gaining him any money. This isn't promoting him in the culture. This is putting him on his knees saying, oh God, please remember these things and use them. But he's interested in the sake of the people. He's interested to the point where he will do what it takes to accomplish God's best. And he wants to do it for their benefit. You might watch Nehemiah and say, gosh, the guy needs anger management classes. Or, man, I thought you were a Christian. But he is. He loved the Lord. And his anger was totally righteous. You can't do this here. Look what you're doing to the kids, to the people, to the next generation. And it just blew his mind. He wasn't going to put up with it. And then in verse 22, he took the Levites that should have been doing this to begin with, told them to cleanse themselves, and then put them out at the gate to guard the gates, to sanctify the Sabbath, began to train them and teach them what they should be doing to lead the people in the ways of the Lord. And Nehemiah, again, remember me, God. Concerning this also, spare me according to the greatness of your mercy. And it's an interesting prayer because one of two things is going on. Either, as he asked for God to spare him by his great mercy, either Nehemiah was encountering the wrath of all of the businessmen who had now lost great money, and he was the reason. It was his rules, and he was digging into their profits, and they were furious. Or, because the word mercy means not getting what you deserve, it is possible that Nehemiah felt greatly responsible for the backsliding of the nation. And that in his attempt to square these things away, he carried this enormous burden on his shoulders because he felt like somehow he had left the place okay, but he'd come back and it wasn't okay. And in either one of those things can be true the way that the words are used. In any event, Nehemiah was very interested in the Lord being honored. It wasn't popularity. It isn't pride. It isn't self-interest. If you're interested in popularity and pride and self-interest, you will probably not confront someone who's living in sin. You'd probably rather just send them to the church and let someone else do it. But if you're interested in pleasing the Lord, sometimes the best you can do for somebody is tell them that they're way off line, and that's not going to fly with you. It's a faithfulness that we need in the church. I'm not talking about sin sniffers and the hounds of heaven. I'm anointed for the rebuke ministry, But there are people who live in sin, and they should hear that from you. You shouldn't look the other way. You shouldn't sweep it under the rug. They shouldn't be over your house having dinner. You should be telling them what's up. You get it right with God. And Nehemiah did. Oh, God, remember me concerning this also. And then we read, verse 23, in those days I also saw the Jews who had married women from Ashdod and Ammon and Moab, so that half their children spoke the language of Ashdod. They couldn't speak the language of Judah. They spoke according to the language of one or of the other people. The intermarrying of the Jews with the heathen nations round about, which, by the way, is on every page in the Bible when God directs his people, that he was against it. It isn't that God is prejudiced. It isn't that God has some ethnic, persuasion. His only concern is the spiritual well-being of the people. He wanted to keep them for himself. He taught them to be in fellowship with one another, to marry with those who loved God as they did, and to not place themselves in a position where they could be dragged away from and other things invade the heart of those who once knew the Lord. Eventually, these kids weren't reading Hebrew. They couldn't read the Bible. They couldn't read the Word of God. They were devoid of it. They were learning the lessons and the ways of the world, and it was the choice of the people. So, back when they were repenting, chapter 10, they said to one another, all right, let's make some deals with God. What's our first deal? Okay, first deal, we're not going to get involved with the world around us anymore. We're not giving them our kids to get married to. We're not taking kids from them to marry into our families. We're going to commit ourselves to the things of God. And it was drastic, but it was absolutely necessary. Now, though, with the daily diligence needed gone, it's all right. No, he's not saved, but look how good looking he is. Or no, she's not saved, but she's not against God. She's not for God. And into the world we go. We compromise and we lose that edge, that relationship that God wants us to have. Well, it wasn't going well with Nehemiah, verse 25, so I contended, that's that screaming word again, with them. And then I cursed them. And then I struck some of them. And then I pulled out their hair. And then I made them swear by God, saying, you shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or for yourself. Don't marry the heathen. Swear before God. Don't you wish you could solve everything like this? We're so tactful, aren't we? Oh, we're so tactful. And we should be tactful, but we should also seek to be holy. And I always worry when people hate to confront sin. I don't mean failure. We've all failed, but folks who've decided in their lifestyle to just live in sin. And we just look the other way. Well, he hadn't hurt me, he hadn't bothered me, he hadn't said nothing to me, I don't need to say nothing to them. Really? I say you do. I say it's your responsibility to say something. If you love someone, you warn them. Oh, you're going to hell. Not really my place to tell you. Road out ahead, no problem. I love Nehemiah's passion. I know in the culture, Nehemiah could get away with this. I don't think you could get away with this today, or there'd probably be more godliness. But we hate to confront. And I thought about this week Nathan. Nathan was a young prophet who the Lord told to go tell David about his sin with Bathsheba, that God was well aware of it. And I'm thinking, that is not the job Nathan wanted. David could kill you on the spot. In fact, what he was going to go talk to him about ended up getting a guy killed. So go tell him, oh, I don't know. I don't really want to say anything, But he did, and God used him. Jesus had this unique approach to ministry in John chapter 2, and then later at the end of his ministry in Matthew 21, Jesus walked into the temple and just greeted those selling stuff there. He turned over their tables. He chased them off with whips. He screamed at them, don't you make this a place of gain. This is a house of prayer. That's not Jesus meek and mild, That's not the baby Jesus. That's Jesus angry that man has so corrupted the things of God. And he made his point well known with the vendors. We don't want to hurt the feelings, but look at Jesus. And you have to realize sometimes what's at stake. In the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord sat the disciples down. He said the most ridiculous thing, or the most remarkable thing. He said to them in chapter 5, verse 29 of Matthew, if your right eye offends you, pluck it out and cast it from you. Better that you, or more profitable for you, that one of your members perish than that your whole body gets cast into hell. Now that's hyperbole for sure. because if you yank out your right eye, you've always got your left eye. That wasn't the issue. But the issue is this: there are some times when the value of what you're facing is of such great importance that you should do whatever it takes to be sure that you assure it at the end. And the Lord said, it doesn't really matter what you lose in the process. You got to get to heaven, because hell is no place to be, whatever that costs. However you're pushed to that place. And to me, it's one of those dramatic kind of statements. All it does, though, is it stresses the importance of seeing what is important. And the Lord said to the disciples, get rid of whatever keeps you from God. That's the kind of drama that Nehemiah finds himself in. And I see the contending and striking and the pulling of the hair. Okay, that's cultural, but he got his point across. You know, the people went, all right, I'm not losing any more my hair. He continues in verse 26, and he said, look, didn't Solomon, the king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among the many nations, there's no king like him who was so beloved of his God, and God made him king over all of Israel. And nevertheless, pagan women caused him to sin. Should we then hear of your doing this great evil and transgressing against our God by marrying these pagan women? Now, don't lose his point. His point is, if you look at the past, even guys that had the greatest walk with God possible, the most blessings that they could have amassed, guys like Solomon, wiser than any man who had ever lived, powerful, rich, successful, in fellowship with God for years. And yet, it was in this area that he fell. And Solomon died worshiping other gods, far removed from the God that he once walked with. And Nehemiah picks it as the example. Look, it doesn't matter how strong you might have been or how wise you think you are. The wisest guy in the world, the most blessed guy around, couldn't stand when he let this area of his life begin to fall. Daily diligence. You don't get into affairs overnight. Daily diligence. And Solomon, was given great wisdom, and yet he fell. He wrote Proverbs 6. Go read it sometimes. You know what he said? Watch out for them women who stand on the corner, beautiful-looking women who nod, and wink, and invite you in. They're going to be your death. Stay away from them. But then later on, he became the victim of his own counsel. Went on TV and said it was a private affair. Don't ask me about it. Look, we're supposed to be separate from the world. And here they were marrying into the world. We do a lot of marital counseling and premarital counseling here. We require folks to get married here to go through 6 months of premarital counseling. And people usually, they go, what? No, we don't like that. Well, then go get married somewhere else. Because doing the wedding is easy. It takes 45 minutes and you get free food. Every pastor likes doing weddings. Counseling, however, is a different deal. You want to try to help people make it through life married, know what they're getting into, realize the responsibility. And we'll have folks come in sometimes and we have them fill out this intake sheet and ask them about their spiritual lives, and you're just pretty sure reading that this guy that this woman is bringing in is not saved. And so, you'll say to them, you left the when were you born again part empty. When were you born again? I don't know. And so I say to the girl, what are you doing with this guy? He's not saved. You should run. And they usually then they leave, they don't come back. But we won't marry folks if they're not saved. We just won't do it. Now, granted, they'll get married somewhere else. There's plenty of folks that'll do the wedding. I'll give you the addresses. I know who they are. But that doesn't mean it's right. So, to have someone say, well, he loves God in his own way. Really? What way is that? Or I'm sure when we get married, then we'll start going to church. No, you won't. If you're not going now, you're not. Marriage doesn't change your habits. It just reinforces your bad ones. Yeah, think about it. It'll come to you. It'll be all right. Then we read in verse 28, and one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib the high priest, had now married into Sanballat's family. Now that was the other guy along with Tobiah that had caused such grief to the work for years. Therefore I drove him from me. Nehemiah's a busy guy, isn't he? Confronting, contending, cursing, hair pulling, threatening, striking something. Then you got to run him out of town. Whoo, ministry day, But I love his passion. I mean, what greater passion could you have than a guy that's so zealous for the Lord, he'll do whatever he takes to make sure people walk with God? That's what we need. We don't need relative holiness. We need the pursuit of holiness. And we're weak. We're not going to do well. I understand that. But God help us to not just sweep it under the rug. So he says in verse 29, first, remember them, God, because they've defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites, and I cleanse them of everything pagan. I assign duties to the priests, to the Levites, each to his service, to bring the wood offerings, to bring the first fruits at the appointed time, and remember me, O my God, for good. I mean, Nehemiah, he restores the work of the priest. He gives direction and wisdom and organization, drastic steps. But the people, as a result of the drastic steps of one man, were spared the further judgment of God and were brought into great blessing with God. I think it is important that we find ourselves in a place where God can bless us. For me as a pastor, chapter 13 tells me that the ministry work is never finished. You'll never be done. There's a constant need every day. It would be nice if once you taught the Bible, people just got it. You could go through it once and everybody could retire. But you can't. And those of you that would be in leadership, let me say this to you. You lead the flock. Don't you let the flock lead you. You set the standard. You walk with God. You let him and his ways be more important. And if you fail because of that, then go ahead and fail. Because in heaven you'll be glad you did. You don't want to please people. You got to please the Lord. And you got to stand with him. And that requires a full commitment, because all of us are prone to fall. I mean, Nehemiah was just gone a little while, and look what happened. Moses, I think, was gone less than 6 weeks before down in the valley they were already worshiping calves. It only took 6 weeks. I worry about pastors that I hear of in different churches that are gone all the time ministering somewhere else, and I wonder who's taking care of their flocks. It's all right to be gone once in a while, but months at a time, weeks at a time, where are you? Oh, I'm out ministering here, I'm ministering there. How about your people? Take care of your people. But I love the fact that when Nehemiah came back, I know that some of his unorthodox ways wouldn't fly very well, but don't lose sight of his passion. And I noticed that the people listened to him. They responded to his direction. They respected his position. But look, it's easy to lead people astray. Anyone can do it. You don't even have to take a class. But to lead people to the things of God requires a little bit more commitment to the things of God and to study and to knowing it. And we're all prone to turn, Paul said to the Corinthians, where is that? 1 Corinthians 10:12. Be careful when you think you stand, lest you fall. Even at our best time, we got to be careful. Which is why you go to church during the week and why you show up at night or during midweeks, because we need the help. Goodness knows. If I could do it without it, I'd stay home all week. It's easier. But can't. Read the Revelation 2 and 3 of Jesus' letters to the churches. And I think you'll find out there's no guarantee to staying in the Lord unless you daily seek after him. Sometimes it takes radical steps to get back on track, You have to chase Delilah off and chase Tobiah off. But God knows. And I love Nehemiah. He was faithful to the end. God would remember him. You know what? It's been 2,500 years ago since this stuff happened. And you showed up at church today to talk about his life and his ministry. I don't know what happened to Sam Ballard, but I really don't care. I just want to be like Nehemiah. Shall we pray? Father, thank you this morning for your word to us, and especially for this fitting conclusion to a book of great revival that ends up needing to be revived again. And Lord, it is certainly my prayer that for each of us here this morning, we would not find our spiritual lives with you to become mundane or routine, or we can just phone it in. It's lost the emotion and the heart for what we once had for you. But rather that you might stir us to have daily and often and present tense relationship with you that allows us to be learning and growing and as excited as we ever were about the ways of the Lord. May we not lay your word aside. May we not lay fellowship aside. May we not lay our times of prayer aside. May we not just forego obedience because we think we can get away with it. Because we see what happened in Nehemiah's generation, that even with his great leadership and the much seen miracles of God, yet the people were quick to fall. And we don't want to fall. Maybe this morning you're in church and you have done just that. You've fallen. You're away from the Lord. You're here today, but you're really not here. Your heart isn't with the Lord. Your relationship with God is a disaster. Your obedience is non-existent. You make a lot of room for sin, the things of the world, and yet you're miserable. And you should be miserable. There's no life there. Yet God has life. And maybe this morning, this is the message you needed to hear so that you could quit making excuses and just make some drastic changes. Put God first again. Go back to your first love that you've left behind and be restored. And maybe no one has been willing to say it to you, but God will. Maybe no one's been able and willing to call you on it, but God will. And he wants to give you life. He's not putting you on the spot to hurt you, but to help you. Prayer room is open this morning. Before you walk out the back door, if that's you, you walk through that door. And you go resolve your relationship with the Lord. And then you go home with life. And God will remember you for good. And your life will have meaning and purpose.